Although the academic skeptics were skeptics, they were confronted by those who believed that they were not skeptical enough. And this is something that is not uncommon with groups, is that there'll be those who arise, who claim that the group is no longer pure, and they set out to purify the group, or they depart and create a group they regard as purer. So one of these revivers of Pyrrhonian skepticism, what did they do, and what motivated them? Well, as you might recall from the end of academic skepticism, is that Carneades made the classic mistake of compromise, accepting probability. And the purists rejected this, pointing out quite obviously that if we're going to distinguish probabilities and talk about probabilities, that required knowledge. And although if there's only, say, a probability that buses exist so you shouldn't step in front of them, that's claiming that you know there's a probability. And that kind of contradicts skepticism. And so we have a revival of Pyrrhonian skepticism. And of course, Pyrrhonian skepticism was a revival of earlier skepticism, so it's a revival. Now, one of these revivers was our good dead friend Agrippa. He presented the 5 pillars of skepticism. Essentially, these are 5 problems that he claims show that skepticism, well, you can't say that it's known. You can't really even say that it's true. I guess you can say there are 5 pillars for skepticism that do maybe something, maybe not. Anyways, talking in skeptical terms is hard. So here are the 5 pillars. And a person who's not a skeptic would say, these are 5 reasons why you should accept skepticism. But of course, the skeptics really can't say that. But anyways, very, very confusing. So first pillar, disagreement. And he points out what is obviously true. Not everyone will agree on an issue. And that's clearly true. You can take pretty much anything, even things that it would seem obvious that people should agree on, and there'll be people who will disagree. Now, obviously, in some cases, people are just being trolls, but there are people who will sincerely disagree about just about anything. Now, by itself, of course, this hardly serves to establish skepticism. The mere fact that people disagree doesn't prove that we can't know. So this is probably the weakest of the pillars. And despite the fact that it's obviously true, it's utterly consistent with knowing stuff. Because people could disagree, and lots of them could be wrong. The second pillar is our old friend, the infinite regress. And it appears here as a pillar. And as we saw before, if we're going to resolve any issue, any dispute, rationally, we have to give reasons. But if we give a reason, the reasons themselves need reasons, justifications. And if we give a justification, these justifications require justifications, and so on to infinity and beyond. For example, if I say, you can trust what you see with your senses, sense with your eyes. And you might say, well, why should you do that? And if I give a reason, then you can always say, why accept that? And if I give another reason, the clever skeptic can say, but why accept that? And they can play this game forever. And this is a pretty devastating pillar because the infinite regress is pretty bad, and it's hard to stop this regress. Not to say that no one has tried, many have tried, but it does have a lot of bite to it. Next, relativity. This is a point that is grabbed on later, centuries later, in the modern time period. And the modern time period is not now, although modern means like now, but it means historically the time, about the time of the Renaissance up until about 1799. And we're in the postmodern time, which just means we're after the modern time. Eventually it'll be like postmodern. Well, we need better names, clearly. Anyways, back to relativity. The skeptic points out correctly that perceptions of things differ in different circumstances. Now, later thinkers, as I noted, take this and use it for skeptical purposes, but also use it for other purposes as well, talking about primary and secondary qualities and other stuff. what does this mean, and how does it help the skeptic? Well, here's the idea. Let's take something pragmatic that occurs, every day. Suppose you're going to paint your apartment, house, or whatever, and you go to hardware store, Lowe's, Home Depot, Ace, etc., and you get some paint, and you look at it, in the store, and it looks good. And then you go home and paint, and it looks terrible. Now, it's the same paint, but what happens, of course, is that your perception of the paint and the lighting and the circumstances in the hardware store will be different when you get home, because the light will be different, the situation will be different. And so something as simple as painting stuff, what colors look like, different circumstances lead to different perceptions. So in a way, you really can't say what the real color of paint is, because it looks different in different circumstances. And this can be run on all kinds of things, like taste. Like if you taste something when you've got a cold, it tastes different. If you taste a food after you've eaten something else, like, for example, if you eat a whole bunch of garlic and then you have like ice cream, the ice cream is going to taste rather different. And so the skeptics say, aha, you can't really say that say the color of things or the taste of things, because it differs in different circumstances. So you cannot know. And again, they can't say that they know that you can't know. They just say, you probably don't know, or they can't even say probable. But anyways, they would say known, not a thing. Fourth pillar, hypothesis. Now, as you might imagine, one way that people would try to stop the infinite regress is by using a self-evident starting point. Something is self-evident, going back to our good dead friend Plato, is you just see the truth. As soon as you understand it, you just recognize its truth. The light of truth is upon you. And in principle, that would be a way to stop the regress, because you would say, aha, I have this justification that's self-evident. It doesn't need to be justified, so regress stopped. But of course, here's the reply. Someone else can put forth a self-evident starting point that contradicts your self-evident starting point and claim that their point is self-evident. And that's a problem. Now, what the skeptics say is this makes all such self-evident starting points utterly arbitrary, because you could have one, someone else could have one that directly contradicts yours, and so on. So any attempt to use a self-evident starting point, they claim, fails. And it's a pretty good argument. The fifth pillar is kind of the catch-all pillar. What they claim is this. If you were somehow able to avoid the other four pillars, they claim that you'll have to assume what you're trying to prove. In other words, you'll have to engage in circular reasoning. And this is the fallacy known as circular reasoning, begging the question. The idea is it's to assume what one has to prove is an error in reasoning. If someone says, to use a very simple example, if someone says, I'm right, and you ask them, what's your proof? And they say, well, I'm right because I'm right. They're just running in a circle. They prove nothing. And so the five pillars seem to be pretty effective arguments for skepticism. Again, somewhat ironically, because if you say the arguments are really good and they prove skepticism is true, that kind of undercuts skepticism. So you get to use some sort of weird, talking about how it, proves but doesn't prove, and you don't know, but it undercuts knowledge, that type of stuff. Now, skepticism, of course, kept on going. And what some later skeptics did is they took the five pillars and smushed them down to two theses. And they boil it down to this. First is, nothing is self-evident. And secondly, nothing can be proven. Now, if those were true, then obviously we could not know stuff. Because if nothing is self-evident, then there are no self-evident truths, and the only option is proof. But if nothing can be proven, then you can't prove. And, of course, it also works the other way. If nothing can be proven, then you need something self-evident, but they claim nothing is self-evident. So if they were right, again, which is an odd thing to say because they're skeptics, then we couldn't know stuff. So what is the skeptics' kind of end game? Why are they trying to, do their skeptical stuff? Well, for these skeptics, their goal was this. This may seem kind of weird and odd, but their goal was to achieve personal peace. How would that work? Oh, we kind of saw this earlier. If you can't know stuff, there's no reason to worry whether you have the truth or not. Don't worry, be happy. So there's no need to spend effort or worry or concern about separating the true from the false, the good from the evil. So in a way, it's, well, to be, I guess, somewhat sarcastic, it's essentially just kind of given up on, the struggle to know stuff and, distinguish what is good. So once again, they run into the problem we saw before. So, okay, you're a skeptic, you're trying to achieve personal peace, even though you can't know that's worth achieving, and you accept that you can't, you shouldn't bother to try to distinguish truth from falsehood, good from evil. So what do? Well, as we saw before, it's a very conservative position. You should simply accept what appears to be and simply follow existing laws and customs. And weirdly, the most radical of skeptics would seem just super normal because they would just accept what appears to be. They would simply follow existing customs and laws, and they would be the most extremely normal person you could imagine. They'd dress in accord with exactly what's normal. They would follow the customs and laws, and they would be perfectly normal, which is kind of weird. So the end game of skepticism is being super normal. So where did skepticism go from there? Well, it's still around today, alive and well, but not as dominant as it was back in the day. But here are some of what skepticism did and some of what went wrong with skepticism. So skepticism ran into some problems. As I've kind of alluded to, it really makes no sense to create an argument unless you have some starting points, premises. And this implies there are reasons to believe the premises are true. So we could make kind of a meta-argument that to argue for skepticism defeats skepticism, as I was kind of, somewhat, sarcastically saying, you can't really say they're arguing for their point and proving their point because they're skeptics. And so if someone's arguing for skepticism, trying to prove their point, in a way they're kind of refuting their own skepticism. Because to the degree they prove it and show the conclusion is likely or believable, they're undercutting their skepticism. So the most consistent skeptic would say nothing. They would just think skepticism and then not try to argue or engage with anybody, not try to prove anything. They would, again, they'd probably appear super normal in a way. So perhaps the most normal person you know is some sort of super skeptic. So why are they worth considering? I mean, aside from the obvious fact, they historically important, etc. Well, they did contribute a lot. When you have skepticism out there, philosophers need to be more critical, and they have to be less dogmatic, because there's always the skeptical challenge, raising the question, why? How do you prove that? And so as a philosopher, you have to either accept their skeptical arguments or respond to them. And one of the early responses was given by our good dead friend St. Augustine when he wrote against the academic skeptics. In the modern era, again, not now, but around the Renaissance up until about 1799 or so, depending on how you want to characterize the modern age, it was picked up, dusted off, and reused as a tool or a weapon in the form of methodological skepticism, ironically used to attack skepticism. So Descartes was the guy, and we'll look at him in the near future. He gets the fame for really grabbing hold of the skeptical tool and trying to use it as a sword to kill the dragon of skepticism. How does it work out? Well, we'll see. There's also our good dead friend, George Berkeley. Berkeley was the guy who, the whole tree thing, if a tree falls in the forest and there's no one there to hear it, doesn't make a sound. Yeah, he's that guy. His answer, it doesn't make a sound because God's always there to hear it, and God watches everything all the time. Which is either really nice, God's always watching you, or slightly disturbing, that God is always watching everything you do all the time. So what George does is he kind of weirdly says that everything is just ideas. There is nothing, there's no matter behind it. And he does this in part to avoid skeptical problems, because the usual problem in the external world is, how do I know that behind my experiences there's a real world? And George just really just bypasses this whole thing. He says the appearance are the reality. So he sort of embraces a skeptical position, but takes it as defeating it. So the skeptic says, well, how do you know there's something behind the appearances? And Berkeley just says, there's nothing behind the appearances. And the skeptic is part like, wait, well, what? Also, as we've seen, we've talked about our good dead friend Immanuel Kant, some religious philosophers use skepticism to attack arguments and reason, to show that once you show that you can't prove or disprove God, then faith and revelation become possible sources of knowledge. And this includes fellows like Erasmus, Pascal, Montaigne, Bale, and of course our good dead friend Immanuel Kant. There are those who also think that skepticism played a role in the development of science, namely a switch from metaphysics to empirical science, although that of course can be debated. Now, as I mentioned, skepticism in its heyday was pretty popular, but today of course people do still talk about being skeptical, but it would be unusual to find someone who says, I'm skeptical. And if you were to say to them, so are you an academic skeptic or you're a Pyrrhonian skeptic? Unless they've been, corrupted by philosophy, they would probably have no idea what you meant. So what happened to skepticism? Well, here's why it declined. It never really succeeded, as you'd suspect, in creating peace. Because if a person just go around saying, well, yeah, I can't know any of this stuff, I can't know if my rent's due, I can't know if smoking causes cancer, I don't know if I have to eat food, that doesn't seem to be something that would lead to peace. I mean, on one hand, it kind of seems like it does. Just don't worry about anything. On the other hand, not worrying about anything would seem to, for most people, unless someone's really lucky, lead to a lot of problems. And it did create a lot of confusion. It did undermine dogmatism. So when people would just say it's true because, the authority says so, or true because I say so, and the skeptics do have an important role in undercutting that dogmatism. The downside, though, is skepticism is all attack and no build. I mean, it can tear down, its opponents and break everything. It's everything on fire. But then, once everything's broken and on fire, the question is, what does it have to offer? Now, of course, you could say that's all you get. You get a broken world that's on fire, and that's reality. But people generally tend to want, perhaps wrongly and incorrectly, they want positive alternatives. They want not just destruction and things being on fire, they want things being rebuilt. And again, they could be totally wrong. Maybe all we have is, burning ruins, dumpster fires forever. As I noted before, the skeptics said, kind of oddly, instead of saying, just be radical, do whatever, they just said, yeah, just go along with existing traditions. Just dress as, everyone else does, believe what everyone believes, and just be perfectly normal. And that's probably not super satisfying to someone would be drawn to, philosophical inquiry, to be told, going to someone and saying, oh, I heard you're this radical, thinker, tell me what I should do. And if the person says back to you, what you need to do is get a nice bland polo shirt and some nice khakis, get a mid-range job, maybe go for mid-management, watch whatever everyone else is watching, talk what everyone else is talking about, just be the normal person. And that would seem probably pretty disappointing. Another thing was, of course, that skepticism did have positive competitors who offered more than just like a big dumpster fire. For example, their religious philosophies and Christianity was a huge competitor to skepticism. And as you might imagine, you're way back there in the day walking through the town, and you hear some skeptic, talking about, you can't know anything, nothing is known, just, go along with the system. And someone else says, hey, do you want to get infinite heaven forever and ever? That seems way more appealing, because if someone just offers you dumpster fires and khakis, and someone else offers you the possibility of true salvation, it's got a much better sales pitch. And so although skepticism fell out of popular appeal, it does still live on to this day, and it still plays an important role, because a key component of philosophy is being skeptical, not just simply believing things, but requiring proof. Now, one of the great skeptics, in the terms of using it as a method, is our good dead friend Rene Descartes, and we'll turn to him next.